All right, welcome everyone. My name's E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle, and I'm here with longtime Charis friend Moya Bailey. It's very
Hello.
exciting. Moya served on our board of directors in the mid 2000s, and we have not seen each other in person in a really long time, but I still think of Moya as Charis fam and certainly Atlanta family. So this feels like a really special reunion tonight. I'm glad to be here with all of y'all. You know, it's very weird to be coming to you from my living room, um, but it's also wonderful. We're really enjoying this opportunity to get to connect with folks all over the country and to have a national audience for these events. So I know there's going to be folks joining us, you know, to view this from all over the world. We've had lots of international audiences for our events, which is something we've wanted for a long time. So the flip side of this pandemic, as hard as it is that we are getting to engage in this, in this digital activism and in connecting across digital communities. So I wanted to welcome our co-presenting sponsor tonight, which is the Lola. The Lola, I'm going to put a little web tag in here right now so folks can go explore the Lola. If you don't know about it, they are an amazing co-working and women's activism space, inclusive of trans folks. Really wonderful spot that we're really excited about in Atlanta. They're here to celebrate this book with us. So I hope some Lola folks, if you're on the line, I see Martine, who's one of the founders of the Lola, is here, but if other folks from the Lola are here, feel free to light up the chat. We'd love for folks to say where they are watching from. At the bottom center of your screen, there is a ask a question function. So feel free to go ahead and start putting your questions for Moya in here. And then you'll see this teal button at the very bottom middle where you can purchase hashtag activism from Charis right now. So we know you're going to want this book. It was relevant when it came out a few months ago. It has only gotten more relevant. It will only get more relevant. So really, I've invited Moya to begin with a reading and a contextualization of the overall work. Also, maybe say a little bit about her two co-authors who are not with us tonight, and kind of how the collaborative project came to be. And then we'll take some questions and talk about, anything y'all want to talk about regarding what is hashtag activism, what are the hashtags that we're using right in this moment to organize one another, and where's the movement going from here. So please welcome Moya Bailey. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, ER. I'm so excited to be here. I really hate that we couldn't do this in person because I've been missing you all so much. But this is definitely a wonderful way for us to connect. I'm coming to you from Boston on land traditionally stewarded by the Wampanoag, the Massachusetts, and the Pawtucket. I've been in Boston for the last 6 years. And during that time, I've been at Northeastern University. And I had two colleagues there, Sarah J. Jackson and Brooke Foucault-Wells. And we were part of a feminist writing group, much like something that would come out of Charis. And in our writing, we realized that we were writing about hashtags. So I was looking at Janet Mock's hashtag Girls Like Us, and just looking at the way that network sprung up, what made Janet decide to create it, etc. At the same time, Sarah and Brooke were working on a project together on the hashtag MyNYPD. And so that hashtag was one that was created by the New York Police Department, and they had hoped that they would get lots of wonderful, sweet comments from people in the community who would say how my NYPD had been good to them. But of course, they were flooded with people complaining about their experiences and showing a lot of police brutality. So we were, interested that we were all working on hashtags, and we were coming at it from different perspectives. Brooke is a network scientist. Sarah is a communication scholar. I'm a digital humanist and women's studies scholar by training. So we were like, we should think about writing something together. And what came out is the book, Hashtag Activism. And honestly, it's a book that neither of us could have written by ourselves. And what was possible because of our different methods and our different trajectories. So I'm just going to read to you this one part in the introduction that kind of gives the scope of the book. And then I'll read a little bit from the chapter on Girls Like Us, because it's another one that I find really compelling.
Great.
Thanks. So hashtag activism is a term that first appeared in news coverage in 2011, and it describes the creation and proliferation of online activism stamped with a hashtag. In this book, we argue that online activism leads to material effects in the digital and physical sphere. In this book, we focus on the activism of members of historically marginalized groups in the United States, which in recent years has had a measurable impact on political debates, social policy, and public consciousness. These hashtag activists, occasionally maligned as slacktivists or armchair activists, because digital activism is sometimes considered less valid than direct action and mistakenly regarded as in competition with it, use hashtags to create social change. As we discuss in the following chapters, such hashtags as Black Lives Matter and Me Too have had far-reaching influence, moving debates about identity politics, inequality, violence, and citizenship from the margins to the center and into places as crucial as presidential agendas. And I think just to your earlier point, like we really see hashtag activism as something that is moving forward in this moment in a new way. So we've seen a plethora of hashtags that have erupted in this new moment. And as you said, I think we were excited, that the book was moving around and that people found it compelling. And then we were sad that, COVID-19 meant that we couldn't, do this particular book talk in person. And then we were even sadder when the book got a resurge in attention because of what has happened in Minneapolis, what has happened in Louisville, all of the things that are happening across the country to Black folks. So it's been both, heartening that people find the books useful, but then also just troubling that we're in this moment where this book is useful. And so now I'm going to turn to the chapter that I was primarily responsible for, which is the chapter on Girls Like Us. And I want to start with how this hashtag Girls Like Us was used. And so we write, trans women use the hashtag Girls Like Us in three primary ways: to connect with one another on everyday, often mundane experiences, as a way to advocate for trans issues and rights, particularly through critiques of mainstream representations of trans people and anti-trans violence, and three, to celebrate the accomplishments of trans women. And this third use of the hashtag often overlaps with the previous two. So even though these categories have been, delineated here, we actually saw in the work that there was a lot of overlap. So I want to talk a bit about the second item here as a way to advocate for trans issues and trans rights, and this way that creating change is possible through the hashtag. Hashtag Girls Like Us tweets that focus on advocating for trans issues and rights do so by elevating the voices and history of trans women and sharing facts and information about trans experiences with injustice. These tweets are educational, a call to action, or both. For example, the Twitter user Trans March, a San Francisco organization that works to, quote, inspire all trans and gender nonconforming people to realize a world where we are safe, loved, and empowered, end quote, regularly tweets educational and biographical information about trans activists and figures like Marsha P. Johnson, Jazzy Collins, Billy Cooper, and Chelsea Manning. Tweets in this category also work to connect issues of trans liberation to intersectional concerns of poverty, racism, and sexism. For example, Janet Mock connected the case of Cece McDonald to that of Trayvon Martin, the Black Florida teenager killed by neighborhood watchman George Zimmerman, whose case we consider in the next chapter. By using the hashtag Justice for Trayvon alongside Girls Like Us and Free Cece, Mock illustrates the connection between anti-Black violence and trans identities, often left out of conversations on racial profiling. At the same time, Mock makes the issue of anti-Black violence, too often excluded from the mainstream LGBT movement, central to her brand of advocacy. And so here, one of the things that is really important, one of the things that I think comes through is that we see trans folks and people using these hashtags in ways that create an intersectional lens that is often left out of mainstream television. So if you were looking at something like, for example, CNN or Fox News, unfortunately, you'll see that people really want to talk about things in a one-dimensional way and don't want to look at the intersections. And so Twitter is really a place where people are able to do that intersectional work without having to wait on mainstream media to do that for them. So very easily, you can thread these different conversations. As an example, Trayvon Martin with Free CC, and have a conversation that is not happening in mainstream television or in mainstream news media or in mainstream outlets. So Twitter as a platform, and hashtags particular, give you the opportunity to thread different movements together. And that was one of the things we found so exciting about the work that we were doing and what we saw in the book. So I think I will stop there because I've been talking a little bit of a lot. So I'm open to, your questions or other thoughts you might have.
Great. So I want to invite folks to begin putting questions in the ask a question function in the bottom middle of the screen, but I certainly have questions for you that we can get started with. So, the thing that I am really struck by and was struck by in the book is this sort of ability to have the intersectional conversation, right? And the ways that hashtags allow a cross-referencing that's not really allowed on any other platforms. And so do you think that Twitter intended that? Do you think Twitter thought it was going to be a movement tool in any kind of way, or is this a happy accident?
Totally a happy accident. Twitter had no idea. And actually, it was the users who made hashtags something that happened on the site. So initially, people were tweeting and they wanted to have conversations that were threaded together, conversations about the same topic. So one user was like, oh, you know what we should do? We should do what we used to do on listservs, which was use the # and create a tag for the word. And that is how we started to see hashtags on Twitter. And so Twitter itself adapted to that use. And now when you click on a hashtag, there's a link that takes you to all of the uses of that hashtag. That did not exist when Twitter started or when people first started using hashtags. That is something that developed because of how users were taking up the platform. And so I think that's one of the really beautiful things about individual people coming to a particular platform is that they create what they need and the platform just has to follow suit. So we've seen Twitter make some concessions and some changes, a lot of it driven by what users are doing. So another thing that happened, in the early, when we first started writing about this and some of the earlier hashtags that we were looking at, this was before when you would link a picture. And so there would be a link in the tweet and you have to click out to see the picture. But now we can see the picture or the video in the tweet itself. Sometimes the video will start playing without you wanting it to. And so that is one of the things that has shifted and also has shifted the way that people respond and use Twitter.
So one of the things that I was curious about, often when people critique hashtag activism, there is a critique that it's all ephemeral, right? And so doing movement histories like this is challenging because you're tracing things that people assume to be too ephemeral to be traced. I think that's kind of a false critique, right? But also I was curious how you decided what was lasting enough to rise to the level of being studied. Because I think, in our sort of culture of distraction or, difficulty around what breaks through long enough, right? And even reading some of these hashtags, I was like, oh, I remember that. But I wouldn't, if you asked me to list out what are the most important movement hashtags of the last 10 years, I don't know that I would have arrived at all of them. But I can see when you're sort of charting this taxonomy that they become important and one leads you to the next. So how did y'all kind of sort out which ones got included and which ones didn't?
Oh, that's such a good question. And this is where the network science becomes really important, because we could see, using the network analysis, what hashtags were actually trending, what were the hashtags that had longevity, and also what are the hashtags that were connected to other hashtags. So Girls Like Us being connected to hashtag Black Lives Matter, being connected to Trayvon Martin, gave us a sense of its significance because we saw it in multiple networks, and we also saw some of the same users in different networks. And this was another piece of the work that we thought was really important, giving the people who were primarily responsible for the hashtags or were prominent users of the hashtag space to talk about that. So in each chapter, there's a page or two where we have allowed the folks who primarily used the hashtag or even created the hashtag to talk about its significance to them. And I think that was like a really important point for us, because so often academics are not the best when it comes to working with the public on anything. And this was something that was really driven by Twitter users. And so not to have their voices there, we didn't feel like was appropriate. And they really were the ones who told us through their actions and through their retweets what was important to them. And that's how we were able to determine what were the things that lived on and had some staying power beyond perhaps our own just, cursory look at what's trending on Twitter today. It was really the repetition and the retweets, people selecting for themselves what was important to them, and how these hashtags, as you said, build on each other. So UOCasis and Fast-Tailed Girls and some of these smaller hashtags that people don't remember as well really set the stage for hashtag Me Too to start trending, because those networks were already together because of these previous hashtags. So when something like Me Too comes along, there are already networks and ways for that hashtag to move in ways that it wouldn't had some of these other hashtags not existed before.
I think that's such a cool thing to think about that I had not really thought about until I read this book, that really this is creating these digital communities that then allow for something to really take off. With the death of George Floyd, I have been thinking a lot about the death of Eric Garner and the hashtag I Can't Breathe, right? And thinking about the repurposing of a hashtag that was significantly aligned with one person and one person's murder with another person. And I'm wondering in general about the repurposing of hashtags to particular moments and what y'all found about that.
Yes, I mean, this was a huge finding, and it relates not just to the names of people that are contemporary, but also to names that predate social media. So one of the things we found is that initially you have the hashtags of people who have been killed, murdered, Mike Brown, George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, but then people started to include hashtags that predate that, like Amadou Diallo, Emmett Till. So people are making a connection between what's happening contemporarily to these things that happened before social media, and seeing this long through line of police violence against Black people. And that, I think, was so important because it, again, gives people the sense that this is not an isolated incident. This is something that has been occurring throughout history. And again, to see these hashtags connected across different movements, connecting Free CC to Trayvon Martin, I think really gives people a different sense of what this violence looks like and who's affected. So it pushes people who maybe wouldn't see CC's experience as connected to Trayvon Martin to revisit that and see how police violence actually is affecting trans women too, and Black trans women particularly. So we've seen that too with what's happening contemporarily. Nina Pop being someone else who's being pulled into the conversation who wasn't part of the conversation before. Or Tony McDade, again, trying to get people to make the connections that perhaps they wouldn't make otherwise.
Do you find instances of misappropriation of hashtags or people misusing, perhaps in earnest, hashtags that they don't understand, or it seems clear? Like, did you have to throw out, and I know, again, you are the digital humanities side of this, but how do you sort the use of hashtags from a place of like intent to maybe a bungling of it, or a misuse of it? Or is that even interesting in and of itself?
I mean, it is, because there are two cases that are related to Girls Like Us where this comes up. So the first time the hashtag Girls Like Us is used on Twitter, it's used because there's a movie that was supposed to come out with Taylor Swift and some other people called Girls Like Us, and it was supposed to be a biopic with Joni Mitchell, but the film did not get off the ground. It didn't do well. And the only people who were tweeting Girls Like Us were the studio that was trying to promote this film that didn't end up happening. So when Janet Mock used it, and I think, purely from her own generation, I don't think she knew anything about this previous use, it's effectively taken over. So, before a certain date, you only have this movie studios, really poor attempt at trying to get this hashtag to trend. And then it's taken over by Janet. And then all of the uses of the hashtag after that are trans women. So one of the interesting things that happened, though, is that there is a conservative trans woman named Cami who used the hashtag Girls Like Us in her location. So she actually is overrepresented in the number of tweets using the hashtag Girls Like Us. But it's interesting because through the network analysis, we can see that she doesn't interact with really anyone else in the network. She has her own, co-occurring hashtags, which include the NRA, the GOP, etc. So like her, even though she is, tangentially a part of this community because she's using this hashtag, people just decide to ignore her and they don't really interact with her at all. So she's claiming that she's a part of Girls Like Us, but in reality, what we see is Girls Like Us is specific. It's, people with a particular politic that Cami does not have. And so, her right-wing rhetoric exists in its own space, which is separate and away from the way most people are using, the vast majority of people are using the hashtag Girls Like Us.
That is super interesting. I see we got a couple audience questions. So the Phoenix asks, in your research, did you find that Slacktivism has a substantial or valid role in fostering or fueling social movements?
Yeah, so I mean, part of what we're arguing is that Slacktivism as a term isn't, particularly accurate to what people are doing, and that people are really leveraging both digital activism with activism on the ground, and that their activism in digital space has material consequence on the ground. So we start the book with a foreword by Jeanne Morin, who is somebody who was just using Twitter, did not consider herself an activist. But after George Zimmerman was acquitted, there was a story that one of the jurors was going to get a book deal. And Jeanne just did not sit well with her. How is this person who was on this jury going to profit off the death of Trayvon Martin? So she started a campaign to find out who the editor was. And in less than 24 hours, she got, through her tweets, got the book shut down. And the editor said, we're not going to pursue this book with a juror. And so to me, I think that's a really wonderful example of how, this digital activism then has a material consequence on the ground. And it's something that people perhaps wouldn't expect. And it also came from somebody who previously, prior to that moment, hadn't considered herself to be an activist or organizer. But Twitter allowed her, and hashtags allowed her, to make a pivot in a really short period of time. And that crowdsourced energy made such a difference. So I do think that there's a way that, one, there is a way that people think that online activism, digital activism is less valuable. But in what we found, it's always, or most often, coupled with real material ways that people are connecting. So even when I'm talking about the hashtag Girls Like Us, one of the other beautiful things that came out of hashtag Girls Like Us are connections. So Angelica Ross met her roommate and friend, and they started the digital project Herstory, which is a wonderful web series, if you haven't seen it, about trans women in LA. And that was a connection that was forged on the digital platform, but then led to a material, project, Herstory. And then, of course, now we get to see Angelica Ross in Pose and in, American Horror Story. So all of these things have, this iterative effect that can't always be seen.
I think that, I wonder how much people still feel that slacktivism is a thing, like particularly in this moment, if people are still feeling like that to denigrate it in that way, or if we've moved beyond that. Like, I don't know. I can't really tell if that's still a prevailing thing, or if, I'm thinking about what limited, it didn't take much for the woman in Central Park to very swiftly have consequences that were digital, for what she did to Amy Cooper, and his name was also Cooper. I forget his first name.
Yeah.
That people quickly found out where she worked, quickly found out, everything about her. And it was very like, boop, boop, boop. Like, and then, and to me, that's a kind of internet activism, right? People identifying people, for better and for worse, people are identifying protesters, who are, on the left and doxing them. It gets very murky very quickly, but I do think there's some real positive, like very swift justice that happens too. When you're like, oh, you said this online, like, here you go. Like, does your employer know that you are a white supremacist? Here we go. So I was just curious if you think that the majority of people still feel that online activism is a less legitimate form of activism.
Yeah, I think it depends on what circles you're moving in and how people are receiving and understanding what online activism is. Because to your example, I think some people wouldn't consider that as part of the wide umbrella that I would consider it under of hashtag activism. I do think that there are people who kind of want to separate things and say that this is a lesser form, or this is not as useful as activism that's happening in the street. But as we've seen, there are so many ways that activism in the street is aided by the work that people are doing online. And this was true even before this moment, but we see again, people tweeting, where police are located so that they can avoid those areas. people tweeting, where are safe places to go, and also just the cross movement solidarity around the world, where we have, Palestinian folks again reminding people who are organizing here, don't use water for tear gas, you need to use milk. Like all of those lessons that are being passed down, and Twitter being a really wonderful means for that exchange to happen.
Yeah. It does make the world feel much smaller in a nice way, I think, when you're like, oh, people around the world still love, still have the capacity to care about Americans despite all of the horrific things that America has done. Like that other activists are still like being so generous with their love and energy in this moment. I'm always heartened by that.
Me too.
So there's two very related questions, so I'm going to ask them together. So Lorraine asks, are hashtags of any real value on Facebook? Asking for those of us not on Twitter. And Taryn, Jordan, I think, says, hi Moya, it's Taryn on Ceci's handle. How does your configuration of hashtag activism apply to other social media platforms? I'm thinking here about TikTok and Instagram.
Oh my goodness. Hi Lorraine. Hi Taryn. It's so good to hear from you. So one of the things that we do talk about a little bit is how these hashtags move to different spaces. So one of those spaces being Tumblr, kind of prior to Tumblr's fall from grace, and then what's happening on Facebook and Instagram. So people are having these kinds of conversations on other platforms. But the thing about Twitter that makes it so unique is the short form and the ability for things to move very quickly. So with Facebook and Instagram, if people have their profile set to be closed, then things don't circulate in the same way that they do on Twitter. People can still, of course, have closed accounts on Twitter where it's just their friends, but by and large, the way that people use Twitter is different from how they use Facebook and how they use Instagram. So you see these hashtags spreading in a different way depending on the medium. So Twitter, I think, has made things move, but we're also seeing things shift because of the demographics of who is using the particular platform. So Twitter is aging out. So you'll see, the demographics of Twitter now, I think, are like 30 plus, and the demographics for TikTok specifically are, 20 or less. So different people are being called by these different mediums and are able to use them in really different, unique ways. But the platforms themselves are not necessarily keeping up with how people are using it, and also are doing things that are diminishing the impact of people's use. So, Instagram being bought by Facebook and becoming part of that machine has really squelched a lot of the, I think, unique content and the way that people were using hashtags on Instagram, just because Facebook is an even older platform and the age of the demographics of people using Facebook are much older. So it's changed even the demographics of people who are on Instagram. So I think if TikTok can somehow keep itself away from, these corporate overlords who are interested in kind of buying up these new tools that they find or that they see young people using in really unique and interesting ways, I think that you can see some of these hashtags move in really wonderful ways. But I am definitely worried about how corporate interests kind of take things over. But I am also inspired by the fact that people just keep moving platforms. So many of the people we talk about in this text started out on LiveJournal and then moved to Blogger, and then from Blogger moved to Twitter. And so again, I think people will find a way and will find a platform. So it's less about the platform, but what people are able to do with them.
So do you think there is a utility of using hashtags, particularly on Facebook, if people are organizers, or do you think that's sort of a moot point?
No, I think it can be helpful. But the question is, how open is this, a public post? Is this something that people can access easily? So much of Facebook is trying to drive and limit and narrow your content, which is a different mindset, I think, than what Twitter has tried to do. So I think it again depends on how you are trying to push up against the parameters that the platform wants to set out for you.
Yes, for sure. So Patricia asks, how do you think digital activism will be preserved in the historical record? It's a bit different than what archives typically collect. So how do we ensure that it is preserved in some way?
Yes. So one thing that is helpful is that the Library of Congress has been collecting all tweets since the beginning, which is great. What is unfortunate about that is it's not clear how anyone is going to ever access those tweets. So there's no, the data is being collected, but in terms of being able to recall it or actually use it, that's not been something that the Library of Congress has figured out. So in theory, you should be able to go to the Library of Congress and say, I want to see, Moya Bailey's tweet from, June 5th, 2014. And you should be able to do that, but they don't actually have the facility to do that currently. So the question then becomes, what are some of the other ways or other places that things are being archived? One thing that exists is the Internet Archive, the Wayback Machine. So it collects random screenshots of pretty much everything that's on the web. But again, these are static pages, so you can't really click through links. You're not going to be able to access that information beyond what is available on the screen. So it becomes its own problem because so much of this has to be experienced through the digital platform that it is on. And this is also a question for websites as we move towards things like WordPress and other web tools that are kind of out of the box and you get to move things around, etc. Earlier versions of websites are being lost. So there's actually a couple of archivists who are working on trying to preserve people's old, janky HTML websites, just so that we have a record of what things used to look like when we didn't have pretty templates and CSS to make our web pages look great. That early history of people actually making and moving and changing the font, etc., is important, but how to preserve that and make it accessible for people is still a question. So I think that it's an ongoing issue and definitely one that is changing because the hardware is also changing and the way that we use the internet is changing. So I think these are important pieces that people are still trying to figure out and wrestle with.
So you talk a little bit about the challenges to, in the conclusion, and one of those is bots and trolls and things like that. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of the weaponization of Twitter against the left at various points and the ways in which we know that people on the left are unfairly policed, or, the rules are much more heavily enforced against, or it would seem, against leftists than they are against white supremacists on the internet, for example. And, at Charis, we've experienced this, that if you use the word lesbian, for example, that is a word that actually gets flagged in ways that can interrupt your tweets. So I'm wondering a little bit about how our own words can cause, like our language for us, can then cause our content to be policed or blocked. And yet when it's weaponized against us, that's given free reign. Or at least that's my
Yes.
perception.
No, that's absolutely accurate. I had a conversation with an unnamed platform about this very issue, that there seems to be a way that people who are trying to call out the way that racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia is being used on the platform are the ones that then end up getting targeted, get their tweets blocked, get their accounts suspended, etc. And so part of this is connected to who's doing that work and what's being used to flag, and that being an automated system. So if there is this automation that doesn't include humans who are looking at these things, then it's going to disproportionately target our communities. And there's actually some other conversation about how the right and people on the very far right have been particularly good at getting folks on the left targeted in this way by kind of baiting people into conversations, and then they're the ones who end up getting the platform censure as opposed to the person who started the conversation. So, and bots, I think, are another way that this happens. But one of the ways that people are trying to push back on that is to teach people how to make bots, and to make bots that do things that we actually want them to do. So there's a bot that I just learned about that promotes different things that women and people of color say, that is something that is lifting up different Wikipedia entries by and about people of color and women. So trying to make sure that there are ways that bots can be programmed to do things that we want them to do, not just some of these negative ways that they get used on the right. And even outside of bots, we have to think about people like, 45 in particular, who has been using Twitter and has actually, caused them to really rethink how they are allowing information to spread that is inaccurate, false, etc. So we can see that it's not just at the level of bots, but it's actual people who are provoking and doing things that are harmful and that need to be addressed at the level of the platform. But that, of course, requires different people behind the platform. So you'll see that there's been a move to try and get more people who have humanities, critical race studies backgrounds into some of these tech spaces to challenge a lot of these ideas that people there just take for granted.
There's been a lot of pushback on YouTube around sort of the rabbit hole nature of YouTube, that you get pushed further and further right or maybe left, depending on, the autoplay feature. And some people have made a similar critique about Twitter, that like you based on, oh, you should follow this, and then you go down a similar rabbit hole. Do you think that critique is fair of Twitter?
Yes, I think that algorithms specifically are designed to pick up on the little things that they see and kind of guide you down a particular path. And what is unfortunate is that a lot of us are not privy to how these algorithms work. And to be frank, a lot of these platforms aren't really sure how their algorithms work either. So we see a lot of the biases that we have in society manifesting in how these algorithms operate. So more needs to be done to make that process much more visible. And the idea that it's somehow neutral because it's a computer is really been, of course, proven to be false. And so, Sophia Noble's work about algorithmic bias, particularly looking at Google, and how, similar to the way that you were talking about lesbian being one of those words that are flagged, it wasn't too long ago that if you looked up Black girl, it would automatically take you to pornography. So that, or Black woman even. So her work got Google to change some of its practices so that that doesn't happen in the algorithm. But Google still hasn't been transparent about why that happened in the first place, or how to prevent something like that happening again around another topic.
Yeah. So Aisha asked, as you worked on your book, did you keep records of tweets and or donate the interviews to an archive? If you kept the tweets, consider connecting with the Doc Now tweet catalog.
Thank you. We did keep some of the tweets, and this is also about kind of our own practice. So for every Twitter handle that you see in the text, we reached out to that person to ask if it was cool if we used their Twitter handle in the text. So as I mentioned before, academics have been particularly egregious about taking people's Twitter content and social media content and using it for their own purposes. And we did not want to participate in that. So part of our practice was, of course, inviting people to write for the text, but then also making sure that the Twitter handles that we used, we were using with permission. And if not, they were anonymized, or we just didn't quote the tweet. We might paraphrase something from a tweet. And so I think in terms of keeping them, we kind of made the decision that what was in the text is what was kept, and the other things would be released, because we did not want to violate people's privacy. Another thing that happened is that some of the Twitter accounts that we used, that we had planned to draw from, people shut down their accounts or changed their names or made their accounts private. So we didn't use those tweets if that was the case as well. So we really wanted to respect people. I mean, I think there's an assumption that because Twitter is a public platform, it's social media, that means, it's all fair game. But the consequences and the ramifications of using people's tweets in other contexts, we've seen too many people hurt by this, and particularly us, our community. So we wanted to be very, very careful about how we did that. But it's good to know that there are resources out there where it can be utilized. And one last piece related to that is we couldn't have written this book in this current moment. So that's one of the things that's been a surprise. When we started writing this, Alan Mislev, who is another colleague at Northeastern, had created a script that was pulling 10% of all tweets from Twitter. And so he was getting a random collection. And once people at Twitter found out that he was doing this, they asked him to stop. And so he did, but then they were allowing researchers access to tweets at a 1% sample. And then they decided they didn't want to do that anymore. So it's very difficult for researchers to access the kind of information that we were able to access as platforms are becoming more and more proprietary. And I don't think they really knew fully what they had when they started Twitter. I mean, this goes back to your earlier question, ER. I don't think that they knew that people would be using hashtags to organize. I don't think that they knew that you could tell so much about somebody's likelihood to vote for a certain candidate based on their Facebook posts or their Twitter content. So there's been a real retention on the part of the platform creators to make all of that information more private. So I think it's going to take some activism on our part if we want to see that shift.
There are people, mostly white men like Jaron Lanier and people like that, who kind of argue for the idea that producing all of this content for free on the internet is a disservice because like companies shouldn't get to own all of this intellectual and emotional labor that people are doing. And if we collectively kind of reclaimed our intellectual and emotional labor, however that would happen, right, that would take like a giant revolution. But like in theory, if we all collectively did that and said, you should pay us for this work somehow, like that we would have a different relationship to our own intellectual production. And I'm wondering if you agree with that, or if you agree with parts of that, or if you think that's total BS.
So this is where, like, I'm like, who's on this thing? Like, don't tell my day job that I think this. But I kind of feel like intellectual property is, a tool of capitalism in general. Like, I don't really believe in that, even as I recognize that, people's labor and intellectual production is important and should be named and attributed to them. But the idea of intellectual property is very Western and also, to me, steeped in capitalism. So I don't think my solution is we need to figure out how to get paid for this. But I do think that we have to figure out how to work towards a community sense that what people are producing is valuable, not only to the person, but to community. And there's a reason that, we still put things on Twitter despite not reading the terms and service agreements. There's a reason we still post on Facebook and Instagram, because we want that connection. There's something powerful there about everyday folks being able to connect in ways that we generally would not be able to, especially in this moment where this is what we have. We have digital connection and not physical connection right now. So I do think that we need to reimagine what we are doing when we're creating and producing things for these spaces, and not then become the ones who are monetizing it, because the issue still is the way that capitalism shapes and distorts and transforms our interactions in ways that are really gross. So I feel like less capitalism, even on our end, is where I would like to go.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I find myself like appreciating certain parts of that idea, which are about, honoring that we are doing this cultural work together on the internet. But then where do you go with that? And how do you, and in a capitalist society where so much of the ways that we value things is by attributing money and ownership to them, it's like, how do you shift that? And you are somebody who is known for having coined a term. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that, because it's rare to have a word so wholly associated with one person. Like, so could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And I think it relates to the previous conversation, because, people have asked me if I was going to get it copyrighted or like, stake my claim on it. And I don't, that feels weird and strange to me. Like, I don't want people to like ask my permission before they use it. Like that's just not how it's supposed to work. But in creating the term Misogynoir, I was looking for a way to describe the way that Black women were being treated, both in these images that I was seeing in these medical school yearbooks from the 1910s at Emory, and then also the way I was seeing Black women being represented in popular culture. And it was wild, because I'm looking at this yearbook from 1910, and then I'm like watching a music video in, 2008, and some of the same language or some of the same imagery is coming up. And it's unique to how people are seeing Black women, not just women of color, not just women. And so that's where I kind of got the idea that I needed a word to describe this particular way that Black women are being maligned in media. And so that's where it came from. And I put it on the Clog Feminist blog when I was blogging for them. And it really took off in a way, particularly from the work that Trudy at Gradient Layer had done in terms of talking about misogynoir in other ways. So it's been kind of wild to see this word take off and for people to find it useful. And similarly to, our book, #Activism, taking off in this moment, it's, bittersweet in the sense that I'm glad that people, find it useful, but also like, what the fuck that people have to, use it and find it useful. Yeah.
Right. It's a word that you wish did not have a need.
Exactly.
But I did think it was interesting that you're one of the only relatively young people I know who has coined a word, but it's very, in some ways, similar to coining a hashtag. It's a concept that helps other people find one another, and particularly other people find, intellectual connections and other communities. And I think it's been really powerful in that way. And I've witnessed that even at Charis, Black women finding that term and saying like, oh my God, that's what that is. Like, that is what my experience has been. And particularly within certain, within the academy or within certain professional spaces of being like, I needed this word. And so I feel like there's so much gratitude, and I hope that people say that to your face. But that there is so much gratitude for that word.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. I see we have one more question in the chat, but I also wanted to talk about the utility of allyship and the questions that y'all raise, because I think they're coming up a lot right now. They're coming up a lot for among white people in this moment, how white people are using #Black Lives Matter, how white people were blacking out their screens the other day and trying to be helpful and then messing up and, causing a whole ruckus around, a lot of things. And the ways in which, if people are really relying on a hashtag for real information, and then there's a bunch of allyship that then just disrupts that information flow, that is a disaster, right? And so it got me thinking a lot about what is our media literacy around like how you use a hashtag and when you don't use a hashtag and all those kinds of things. And I saw a lot of digital activists very quickly being like, whoa, hold on. Like, let me teach you how to do this, which was really generous and great. But it was this very real time moment that I was just watching, as I'm sure you were, and everybody probably on this call was like watching play out over, 5-6 hours of like, well, we're shifting this narrative in real time. Right.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how y'all conceived of the utility of allyship, both among cisgender men in the Me Too movement, and then also among white people across the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yes. So specifically for the Black Lives Matter movement, one of the hashtags that we looked at was the hashtag criming while white, which was created by a white cis man who really thought, and I think genuinely was trying to get white people to think about how they're treated differently by the police when they commit crimes. But what ended up happening is that the tweets ended up sounding very celebratory and congratulatory about what white people were able to get away with. And so it didn't end up having the kind of impact that I think he hoped it would have. Like, on the one hand, he wanted people to see how differently white people are treated, but in the process, white people kind of celebrated that different treatment, and it didn't have the same impact that it could have. Conversely, there was a moment right after the women started coming out accusing Bill Cosby of the series of rapes for decades. And so there was a cover on the New Yorker that had all of these chairs, right? So there were women sitting in all of these chairs, and there was one empty chair. And the empty chair was supposed to represent the women who were too afraid to come forward, or women we didn't know. And so that empty chair became a hashtag. And it was Elon James, the comedian, who decided, you know what, I'm seeing the empty chair, and I just wonder if women have stories that they want to tell. And so he opened up his direct messages for women to send him their stories, and then he would post it so that women could post anonymously their own experiences of being this person in the empty chair, this person who had had an experience of sexual violence but hadn't felt comfortable coming forward. And I feel like that was a really powerful example of allyship that was set up very directly by the magazine cover, the empty chair, etc. So it was following this line that had been created by the writers who were women and the people who were most intimately affected by Bill Cosby's behavior. So it ended up, I think, having a much more powerful impact than Criming Well Light, which was born, again, from, I think, a very, generous place, but it wasn't something that was aligned with what the community who was being allied with actually needed or wanted or asked for. So I think that is really the key to allyship and being a comrade or, being an accomplice, as people have used that language, is to be aligned with and follow the lead from the community itself. I mean, even in this moment, speaking of Instagram, there's been this whole thing of social media influencers now putting on blackface as their way to, stand in solidarity, which no Black people asked them to do that. But that was something that they decided was going to be their action and way of supporting without actually consulting the people who were most affected.
Just to clarify, do you mean literal blackface, or do you mean that I have seen people doing like this thing where they are bringing in other Black content creators to like take over their feeds?
Oh, no. That's a different campaign. No, so the Share the Mic, where they're actually, Share the Mic is a campaign where you have white women who are inviting Black women to come take over their feeds because they have lots of people who are following them. No, I'm talking about people who are putting on Black makeup and trying to, and are changing their face as supposedly in solidarity with Black people at this moment, which again, no one asked for that.
No, in fact, people have explicitly been not asking for that for 100 years.
For a very long time, yes.
Yeah, okay. I haven't seen that.
Good for you.
That's a lot. That is a lot. Yeah, I mean, I think that question of, I'm also curious about what it means for white people or men or cisgender people to use a hashtag that is created by the initially affected group. So, what does it mean when white people use hashtag Black Lives Matter, right? Aside from the logistical issue of blocking potential like direction and content around marches and things, what is, is there sort of evidence that is occasionally useful, occasionally not useful? I mean, that is my read of it, but I'm curious, or even when men use hashtag Me Too, I think both as a way to reflect their own experiences as sexual abuse survivors sometimes, but also potentially, as ways to just like say, I'm sensitive. Like, I think I saw some men be like, no, but like, I'm with you, Me Too, yes. Instead of like, that's not quite it, right? So I feel like there's like adjacent to like allyship that's like really trying, but like just slightly missing the mark, not blackface missing the mark.
So this is something called virtue signaling. So that sense of wanting people to know that you're on the right side of history and that you are doing the right thing by, using certain hashtags, using certain language. I think that is more telling about the person using it than it is a problem for the communities who are using the hashtag. I mean, even that question of how Black Lives, people saying don't use hashtag Black Lives Matter for Blackout Tuesday. I think that was also a bit overblown in terms of how people were using Black Lives Matter at the moment to create and continue to do their movement work. And the hashtags that people were using at that time were a bit more specific because they were talking about what was happening in their particular location, etc. So I do think that that virtue signaling is clearly evident to the people within the community who see other people using the hashtag in that way. And to be honest, it's not, as far as I've seen, it hasn't been enough to clog the communication portal to stop the conversations that people want to have and need to have. More than anything, it's just telling on the person who's using it and showing them to be somebody who is trying a little bit too hard to be included in a conversation that is perhaps not for them.
Got it. I think that's a very helpful parsing, because I do think there's a lot of desire to be on the right side of history. And often that gets in the way of doing real work and of being an actual comrade or accomplice or an ally. So I think that's really thinking about what is the call from the affected group, and what is the digital call, what is the physical call in any given moment, and really being like, all right, this is the way to plug in. So
totally. And I think of just to mention. Song, particularly doing these race traitor calls, as being a really good example of what an accomplice can do and be about. Like there are folks who are actively trying to show how accomplices can be supportive. And I think that sort of training is an example, because it's more than just, using a hashtag. There's some real work that's required and some real unlearning that's required. People need to do that.
Yes. So I just dropped the Southerners on New Ground Race Trader Summer Series in the chat. You had some other resources and things you wanted to let folks know about. Is this a good time to do that as well?
Sure. One of the other things that I wanted to mention is BEAM, which is the Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective that Yolo Akili, who's also, a frequent and I would say supporter of Charis and also Charis family from back in the day, has been involved with. And BEAM does really important work thinking about mental health in Black communities. And I think it's just a good resource for people to have access to. They also have a fund which specifically helps Black queer folks in the South get access to therapy, and will pay for therapy sessions because, one of the biggest hurdles, of course, is being able to access therapy if you don't have insurance. And even then, the right insurance that somebody will take, it's just always a uphill battle. So that's definitely something to look into. And then, of course, I don't even need to put the other links there, because you can purchase #Activism from Charis Books and More using that beautiful turquoise green button right under us. So it's perfect.
Yeah, go there now. Get your copy. We've really been impressed with the books that MIT is putting out recently. So we also just did a event with the Data Feminism folks, which is also an MIT Press book, and I feel like they are really leading with with the intersection of activism and digital humanities stuff. And so I was wondering if you could just say if you feel comfortable a little bit about your experience of ending up with MIT.
Yeah, so we were really excited about it because MIT Press does a lot of work around the internet and also these questions of social justice. So our books and another book called Design Justice, the book that you mentioned, Data Feminisms, and then also Design Justice, all three of us kind of see our books in conversation with each other. And Sasha Costanza-Schock, who wrote Design Justice, is connected to us through Allied Media Conference, which is another place that really influenced some of our ideas about how we want to think about the digital world in relationship to our social world, and that we aren't asking enough questions about the digital, and we can ask more.
I just put the link for Design Justice in there. It's currently back ordered, but you can send us an email or give us a call if you would like to order it. I'm also going to put Data Feminism. One of the nice things about Data Feminism is that Charis Circle, our nonprofit, is one of the beneficiaries of the royalties of that book, which is very sweet. So when you buy that book, we get a little chunk of money from it. So that's cool. But I'm loving all of the, the digital humanities stuff that is coming into to inform our activist practices now. I feel like we're really having those tools and having this sort of metadata about our movements is really helpful in this time. It's really helping inform our choices about how we behave on the streets at protests also. I'm seeing a lot more sort of situational awareness among protesters about maybe wear this, don't wear that, don't take your phone, take the fingerprint thing off your phone. Just very basic stuff, but that 5 years ago people didn't really have the awareness of. So, Lorraine is asking, Wilson, yes. Lorraine is asking about Southerners Underground. So Lorraine, I will see. I think in general, if you click on the Race Trader Summer event series, it will pop up, but I'll see if I can send the more direct link. I'll send you the whole calendar here. So I want to make sure, are there any other sort of closing things you want to make sure folks know? Takeaways, top things people should know about hashtags?
Top things you should know. Hashtags are helpful, and we are using them well on the left, but also we might be using something else. And so I believe in the creativity of our social movements to find the things that work for us. So if it's not hashtags, a year from now, then that's cool too. Because I do think that we will continue to find what it is that we need. And I do think that this is a wonderful moment that we're in where we can open up some new possibilities, especially since we're having to rely on the digital so much right now. So I'm really looking forward to what else we come up with. And I think the last question in the chat was just the word, and it was Misogynoir. And you can find out more about it on Wikipedia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Charis also put an explainer on our social media today.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So folks can know about it too. So the last thing I'm going to ask is, we know everybody's financial situation is different, especially right now during COVID, but if you were able to make a donation to Charis Circle, we really appreciate it. Like I said, Moya was a Charis Circle board member back in the mid 2000s. So she has been on this Charis Circle hustling life at various points, asking for money. But we really do appreciate.
Advanced. We used to have a wicker basket that we would pass around. Now
if we were
donate.
digital space, you would still be getting the wicker basket, but in these digital times, we require digital measures. So anything folks are able to give is very appreciated. And of course, we're just glad you're here. We really hope that you'll go home with hashtag activism. We are shipping out 6 days a week and packing 7 days a week. So we'll try and get it to you as quickly as possible. And I hope that if you enjoyed Moya's work, you will go follow Moya on where would you like people to follow you?
Oh yes, please follow me on Twitter at ZB.
Moya ZB. Boom.
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks, y'all. I hope that everyone stays safe and healthy out there. Moya, this was a real pleasure to see you and reconnect and get to enjoy your work. I learned a lot tonight, and I think other folks did too.
Thank you so much. I super enjoyed it. And yeah, we will have to do this again in person one day when that is possible.
For sure. We'll have a big Atlanta homecoming. But until then, be well, and everybody have a good night. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.